Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 351, The Crisis That Came Back Around. Kant's words were very impolite, almost humiliating. However, both sides were currently in a hostile status. Since the war had already begun, there was no need to hold back. At least Kant had the confidence. He was not afraid of this Death Knight who looked no different from a dead person. He sensed it. This Death Knight indeed had extraordinary power. But as time passed, although the extraordinary power contained a dense negative energy aura, it was in fact naturally countered by Kant's king's power and divine power. Otherwise, the two royal knights from before would not have been able to resist 5 Death Knights. Now, there was only one Death Knight. Not to mention Bandake, who could summon the underworld invaders with extraordinary strength. 10 Royal Knights and 10 Lion Knights behind him were enough to crush this small Death Knight. If the 2,000 plus skeleton cavalry behind them were included, the knights who could come over at any time could also turn this dune area into a white bone mound filled with bone fragments. This was confidence, the confidence brought about by absolute strength. It was precisely because of this that Kant dared to be so unbridled. He even brought so few people to meet and carry out the so-called negotiations. That Death Knight looked at Kant coldly. But he was not stupid. As he swept his gaze past Bandake beside Kant, the faint negative energy that was similar to that of a demon made his empty chest seem to fill up with a sense of fear. There were also people waiting at the bottom of the dune. Each of them had their own power. Those who could follow Kant here were not ordinary people. Even the weakest sharpshooter could shoot at a rapid speed. At this moment, the Variga marksmen were already holding their battle bows and staring coldly at the top of the dune. On the body of the Death Knight standing in front of Kant, the armor-piercing all arrows were already on the bowstring. If there were any unusual movements, 20 cone arrows would instantly appear. It was no joke. The Death Knight was silent. It actually realized that if it really wanted to do something, the final consequences would be irreparable. And in the face of Kant's insult and ridicule, it actually couldn't find anything to say in refute. He didn't have the upper hand anymore, but this human noble looked so young actually had an absolute power that made him feel uncomfortable all over. Even though there were still 2,000 plus skeleton cavalry behind him, it still made him feel insecure. Kant did not care about its attitude and the fluctuations in his heart. This was where his confidence lay. Looking at the silent fellow, Kant snorted and said indifferently, "Now I am the lord and ruler of this desert. You have now invaded my estate and started a hostile act that is enough to start a war against me. Now, I want to ask you." Kant paused, his voice was solemn. "What exactly do you want?" Following Kant's reprimanding voice, the knights under the dune behind him stepped forward in unison. Each of them was wearing shiny plate armor that looked like luxury items. The lance and sword were already in their hands. The gems on the tips of the magic staffs in the hands of the mages and mage apprentices also emitted a sparkling light. Elemental power was gathering. The Death Knight was even more silent. The soul fire in its eyes flickered rapidly, as if reflecting its unstable emotions. "Please state your purpose for coming here." Kant stretched out his hand, indicating that they should stop pressing. Meanwhile, his eyes were staring at the blue flame in the empty eye sockets of the Death Knight. He said in a deep voice, "I want to know, do you want to start a war or choose peace? You are intelligent, and the higher level generals behind you should also be intelligent. I need an answer." "Answer." The Death Knight spoke slowly, its voice hoarse as if its throat was rubbing against itself. However, it let out a sinister laugh. "Human, the glory of the gods has faded. We, who once belonged to the bloodline of the gods, have returned. Do you really think that you can rely on your own strength to resist your former master?" Kant narrowed his eyes and held the hilt of his sword. "Please speak in human language." "We're back." The soul fire in the Death Knight's eye sockets flickered. "Ha!" But what it got in response was Kant's horizontal slash as he instantly unsheathed the sword. Golden flames suddenly burst out of his body, and before the Death Knight could even react, it directly cut off its neck. The entire head flew out in an instant. But there were traces of golden light on the broken marks, as if it was fighting against the black fog that was flowing out. The moment the head was severed, the entire body of the Death Knight began to tremble. The warhorse beneath it leaped to the side. The horse with sharp teeth picked up the severed head and fled. "Humans, you will endure a more cruel reality than what we have endured." The Death Knight continued to speak. Decapitation was not a fatal injury to it. The voice was hoarse and filled with hatred. "You don't know what kind of terror, you don't know what kind of existence you have angered. I'll wait for you." Kant had a look of disdain. Looking at the group of skeleton cavalry surrounding the Death Knight as they fled, Kant seemed to be muttering to himself, "Perhaps you don't know what kind of existence you have angered." Kant did not give the order to pursue. There were close to 2,000 skeleton cavalry, and there might be other Death Knights among them. Pursuing was not a wise move. They returned. At the east gate, Varga marksmen, archers, and Swadia crossbowmen were ready for long-range fire. At the bottom, many knights and heavy cavalry were gathered, waiting for reinforcements. Everything was to be safe, to prevent the undead cavalry from acting irrationally and threatening Kant's safety. They returned to Trondheim Castle. Kant's expression was solemn. Looking at Manide and Bandake who were welcoming them, he said in a deep voice, "Get ready immediately. The war is coming." "Yes." The two replied. This was already foreseen. When the undead cavalry chose to retreat and the negotiations between the two sides collapsed, there was no need to continue the negotiations. Those descendants of the ancient era, the descendants of the gods, were the same as the old Pope Kant had met in the underground city. They had also turned into the undead, and with their hatred for the living and their desire for the world, they had made a comeback. What a pity! Kant couldn't help but take a deep breath. The sun disk could only be fixed in one place. If they could control it, with the army going deeper into the Naran desert, the undead might not be able to do anything. After all, this huge artifact-like object had a natural counter to the evil creatures that gathered negative energy. Chapter 352, The Heavily Guarded Fortresses. As the undead cavalry entered the vicinity of the Oasis lookout, the war began. Kant's control over the Oasis lookout and his hegemony over the Naran desert had been directly challenged by the undead that had been transformed from the descendants of the gods since ancient times. The resurrected undead wanted to return to their former prosperity. As for Kant in the present world, he would not hand over the Trondheim castle that he had painstakingly built after going through trials and tribulations so easily. In fact, the undead were right. Kant was indeed enjoying the glory left behind by the gods in the past. By borrowing the sun god's sun disk, he was able to stop the undead from attempting to invade. The sun disk that was cast in gold was extremely huge. The golden disk hovered 50 meters above the sky, like a new sun. Positive energy was gathering. Sacred elements were filling it. It was the sun disk that brought an unparalleled prosperity to the land of the Oasis lookout. It absorbed the heat of the day, dispelled the cold of the night, balanced the temperature of the region, and brought about the prosperity of nature. Oasis Lookout had already entered martial law mode. Teams of desert bandits were released to scout in all directions. However, they found nothing. Under the careful patrol net of the desert bandits, the undead cavalry really retreated. A trail of horse hooves was clearly scattered in the desert, clearly showing the traces of the skeleton cavalry and the Death Knights. Moreover, following this trail, one could definitely find their nest. However, Kant did not agree to the suggestion of going deep into the investigation. Instead, he requested that the whole castle be cordoned off. Even when the civilians went out to take care of the date palm tree and farmland in the outside world, they would send out light cavalry to scout around first. After making sure that there were no problems, they would let the civilians leave the city in batches. Including the table salt trade to the central post house every week, the camel caravans also increased their guards when they went out. Everything was handled with the utmost caution. At the same time, there were also violent soldiers. A week had passed, and the troops in the training ground had already returned. On the city wall, Swadian footmen in chain armor had already appeared. They carried a long lance on their shoulders, a Germanic sword on their waist, and a fan shield on their back. Their faces were cold and stern. This included Swadian crossbowmen who wore iron scale armor and held crossbow in their hands. These were all level 3 soldiers. In a short period of time, they quickly filled in the gaps in the defense of Trondheim Castle. After all, the undead cavalry had already come into contact with the Oasis lookout. Although the existence of the sun disk did not directly launch attacks and destruction, once the regular army of the undead arrived here, the situation would definitely be even more tragic. During this 1 week, the recruitment and training did not stop. The army was still expanding rapidly. Kant was extremely cautious towards the undead that were hiding in the depths of the Naran desert and wanted to expand outwards. Even a lion would use its full strength to hunt a rabbit. Moreover, even after dealing with the threat of the undead, Kant still needed to continue scheming against the dukedom of Leo. Similarly, he needed absolute strength to rely on. And a strong and elite army that could incite fear in any enemy was the safest choice. On the 6th floor of the council hall, inside Kant's own room, he was still resting. It was early in the morning, and the sky was just beginning to brighten. The suitable temperature made Kant sleep very comfortably. With a thin layer of cashmere wool blanket and a specially installed heating fireplace in the room, it was as warm as early summer. A week had passed, and he was also tired for a week. He just had a good sleep. However, the sleep schedule that he had developed in recent days also woke him up at this time. After stretching his body, Kant sat up on the soft velvet cushion. He rubbed his face hard, and his drowsy mind became much clearer. The room was very warm. He lifted the blanket and got out of bed in his pajamas. He went to the table and poured himself a glass of water. There was still warm sweet water with date candy in it. The servants would change it every once in a while to ensure that Kant could use it at any time and maintain his warm status at all times. It's about time. I can finally rest for a while. Kant drank the sweet water and came to the window. He opened a small gap. The cool air seeped in, but it made Kant's spirit even more excited. From 50 meters above his head, the huge golden disk with a diameter of 20 meters was emitting a faint golden light. Even though the moon had already disappeared at dawn, it still made the area covered by the disk appear bright. It was like an extra-large night light, and it was a soft version that did not hurt the eyes. The interior of the castle could be clearly seen. The civilians had all woken up. They were carrying farm tools on the streets in 2s and 3s. Their footsteps were very fast. They looked like they were in a hurry. This included the camel caravans that had just filled up table salt and were preparing to leave the castle. They were also heading to the post house to trade. They were all in a hurry. Kant understood this. Trondheim's castle had entered a strict status. Other than the daily workers and traders, everyone else was quietly staying in their homes, waiting for the army's arrangements. At the same time, a portion of the civilians were formed into teams, specially learning how to defend the city. Of course, it was just the simplest job. That was to move all sorts of military supplies, such as shields, arrows, and stones, or to help clean the city walls and arrow towers, ensuring that there were no obstacles or sundries, which would affect the performance of the defending troops during wartime. In the continent of Karadia, when the lords defended the city, they would specially arrange or train them. After experiencing chaos for a long time, the Swadian civilians were used to these tasks, and they even picked up their weapons. They could hold up some key positions and slightly parry the attacks of the enemy troops, delaying the time of being captured. If they were directly upgraded to a militia, they would be instilled with the combat skills and experience of the militia. These civilians' combat ability would be greatly improved. At the very least, they would be able to defend between the narrow city walls and arrow towers. It would not be a problem for them to wait for reinforcements. However, the real battle would still depend on the elite soldiers. In the castle, Swadian footmen formed patrol teams and patrolled the streets and alleys. Crossbowmen and archers occupied the city walls and stood on the square towers and arrow towers. They watched the periphery of the area they were stationed at coldly and vigilantly looked out for any suspicious targets in the depths of the desert. In the barracks, the knights and heavy cavalry were wiping their weapons and waiting. Outside the castle, the Mamluks, who was good at fighting in the desert, was patrolling in the form of a small team. The date palm forest and the various farmlands, including the pasture, were all patrolling vigilantly. They carried 2 iron staffs on their shoulders and had round steel shields on their left arms. Under the full-body cylinder chain armor, they had cold eyes. They were also waiting. They were waiting for the desert bandits outside the Oasis lookout to report back all kinds of information. Chapter 353, The Special Gift Pack. Kant retracted his gaze. His expression was calm, but his eyes were filled with satisfaction. With such a strict defense and a well-built city, even if the undead army arrived, they would be committing suicide as long as there were no supernatural forces that were difficult to resist. The Swadian crossbowmen and the Variga archers formed the latter firepower of the city walls and arrow towers. The light infantrymen with swords and shields could hold the line in close combat between the city wall and the city gate. If anything unusual happened, the quick reaction force formed by Mamluks and the desert bandits would be able to go to support and ensure that no city gate or city wall would be broken through quickly. Of course, at a critical moment, Kant's extraordinary power would also appear. For example, the Lion Knights, which had now expanded to 30 people, and the level 5 troop class, which was transformed from the level 4 cavalry and the Swadian man-at-arms. They were also good at melee combat and had 200 Sarian lion attendants. There was also the extraordinary power of the Swadia itself. There were 50 royal knights, 300 knights, and 500 newly recruited heavy cavalry. If they encountered a valuable target, they could enter the city walls and arrow towers to cast spells at any time. Whether it was a single target attack spell, an area of effect spell that could cover the battlefield, or a summoning spell, they would be able to catch the opponent off guard. After all, Kant did not know which forces were extravagant to the point where they'd use mages to defend the city. For example, even the Dukedom of Leo could not do it. Although the spells of mages were extremely powerful at close range, to archers, they were equivalent to targets. On the battlefield, the fully equipped ordinary soldiers could kill these delicate mages, who were almost as weak as a chicken, when they got close. They could make a river of blood flow. Although mages had mastered the power of elements, and their status was like that of a noble. But their impact on the battlefield was in fact not that significant. That's why the Dukedom of Leo, or the world, has a decaying spell system. As for the Unfoth Empire, it was as simple as studying a few spells on its own, focusing entirely on the actual situation on the battlefield, and taking the path of completely destroying the enemy's physical body. The so-called pinnacle of magic, the profound concept of magic, was nothing more than a joke to the spellcaster of the world of werewinds. I'll study spells with greater destructive power. I will destroy you on the battlefield. No matter how deep your understanding of magic is, no matter how advanced your concept of magic is, it will still be useless. If I live and you die, then I will be the victor. Based on this concept, it could be said that the development of magic in the world of werewinds had entered the abnormal path of pursuing complete destructive power, killing the enemy troops, and advancing toward destructive spells. Of course, for Kant, this was a very good help. At the very least, it was very suitable for this world. As long as there was war, these war mages would definitely not lose their value. And preparations. Kant closed the window and sat back on the chair in the room. A dialog box popped up on his retina. Honor, 10 points. This was one of the rewards Kant had obtained after completing the special quest of the system in the dungeon and absorbing the pot of greed that had a strong demonic aura. 10 honor points was just enough to qualify for a round of lucky draw in the system mall. And Kant actually had the same thought. Start the lucky draw. In the thought communication system, the treasure box appeared again in the dialog box. Colorful light slowly blossomed, and on Kant's retina, new dialog box popped up, meaning that a variety of gift bags began to appear one by one. You get a special pack, double the number of recruits, constant. You get a special pack, double the number of recruits, constant. You get a special pack, double the number of recruits, constant. You have received a special pack, increment recruitment, random. You have received a special pack, increment recruitment, random. You have received a special pack, increment recruitment, random. You have received a special pack, terrain modification, rock formation. You have received a special pack, terrain modification, hill. You have received a special pack, terrain modification, convex surface. You have received a special pack, terrain modification, upgrade. The notification bar finally ended. This was the result of 10 consecutive draws of honor. However, the system was not done with its notifications. There was an additional reward. You have received a special pack, terrain modification, river. The draw ended. The 11 gift packs instantly turned into golden flashy cards that appeared in Kant's mind. He was slightly stunned. Before he could react, his mind had already realized that this lucky draw was actually full of precious special gift packs. There were no other gift packs at all. So many special gift packs. Kant muttered to himself. He was equally surprised as he glanced at the glittering cards in his mind. Of these special gift packs, 3 were double the weekly recruitment, and 3 were incremental recruitment, which could increase the weekly recruitment by a fixed amount. The other 5 were terrain modification, which came from the rule change. Basically, these special gift packs were preparations for war. The recruitment type could increase the number of troops in a very short period of time. As for the terrain modification, just by looking at the subsequent descriptions on these cards, such as rock layer, mountain tomb, convex surface, and rise, one could understand that they were definitely related to mountain rocks. Kant scanned the detailed description, and a hint of shock flashed in his eyes. This is... He could not help but mutter, a godsend opportunity. Rock stratum could directly create a thick and stable rock stratum in an area, while mountain mausoleum could make the rock stratum appear like a mountain range, which was the appearance of a continuous mountain range. As for convex surface, it could make the rock stratum and mountain range steeper. In the end, all the terrain would be changed by ascending and integrated together. The final appearance would be the abrupt mountain body in the Naran desert, surrounded by a steep and solid mountain mausoleum. Only the top of the mountain was flat, and that was exactly where the castle was located. Use it. Kant didn't hesitate at all. The current situation for him was already on the edge of war, and he could be surrounded by undead troops at any time. If he used it now and made the mountain hold up the castle, the defensive effect would undoubtedly be stronger. As God's view reappeared, the entire Oasis lookout was instantly covered by countless data streams. The entire Trondheim castle also changed with Kant's will. No. This description was not accurate. It should be said that the land under the castle, part of the Oasis lookout, was rising with Kant's will. With a rumble, it was pushed up by the layers of rock and the hill that appeared underground, leaving only the 2 steep slopes on the east and south sides. The rules from the world were changing the shape of this area. Chapter 354, The Castle Built on the Mountain. In a short while, the terrain had been transformed, and the rules of the world were stabilized again. However, in this desert, the only oasis had undergone an earth-shaking change. The soft and dense sand layer had turned into solid rock layers, which rose directly from the underground rock layers. The protruding surface of the ground turned into a mountain mausoleum, just like an open palm, placing a castle at the top. Trondheim Castle, once a military fortress by the Oasis, had now turned into a fortress at the peak of the mountain. The rock layer that rose from the underground turned into a hill. It was like a base. The cliff that was close to 90 degrees was more than 10 meters high, as if it was cut by a knife or an axe. At the top of this cliff, there was also a wide and thick city wall that was 10 meters high. There were towers that were 15 meters high and arrow towers that were 20 meters high. In addition, there was a wooden attic built at the top of the city wall, which made it even more difficult to climb. In fact, the rock wall that appeared at the bottom of the castle could not be climbed by humans. Even a top-notch climbing master could not do it. Moreover, on the top of the city wall, on the towers, and arrow towers, the crossbowmen of Swadia, the archers of Variga, and the light infantrymen who were armed with swords and shields were all ready for battle. The civilians carried stones and heavy logs that were neatly polished. There was also an iron pot that could be heated to pour hot oil at any time. Of course, this method was obviously not very effective against the undead. However, it was effective against enemies who had blood, flesh, and nerves. They knew the feeling of pain. The effect of pouring hundreds of degrees of hot oil into the gaps of the armor was even better than beating rocks and smashing wood. If it was a bit more brutal. After heating up the fecal water, they poured it down. Not only would it be drenched until the skin was split open, the subsequent infection would also be fatal. A certain ancient country on Earth's golden juice, which had never failed, would be able to resist a large number of enemy troops if used properly. After all, not everyone was willing to get close to the stinky, scalding feces. And now, even if it was not of much use to the undead, just the heights alone was not something that the undead could climb up. Those skeletons were just skeletons. Their individual strength was extremely weak. The most ordinary skeletons could not even defeat the most ordinary peasant. For example, the skeleton cavalry that ambushed the post house of the salt mine did not cause much of a result even when the Swedian man-at-arms did not notice it. They were even surrounded by the heavy cavalry and fought their way out alive. Furthermore, as the heavy cavalry chased after them, they fought and retreated. Even their formation did not fall apart. Although the undead did not have any restrictions of fatigue. However, due to the lack of flesh and blood and nerves, they did not have any explosive force. During the war, the Swadian man-at-arms rode their horses and easily shook off the undead cavalry. After resting for a while, they faced the enemy and continued to break out of the encirclement in a stalemate. That was how they left and returned. But now, the castle that had been successfully transformed into the Oasis lookout was not something that regular troops could capture. The 10-meter-long hill was closely attached to the base of the city wall. The entirety of the four walls were steep cliffs. There were only two sides to the southeast, a 5-meter-wide and 20-meter-long ramp in the direction of the city gate. The slope was very steep. The 20-meter-long ramp rose directly to the top of the 10-meter-long cliff. Even if it was paved with stone slabs, it was very troublesome for an ordinary fully loaded truck to climb up this slope. It required the help of a pulling force at the front or a pushing force at the back. The castle was a military complex. Everything was for military considerations. Such a steep slope meant that it was difficult to attack. Not only was it an upward attack. Even if they reached the bottom of the city gate, they would not be able to effectively attack the city gate. The steep slope made it impossible for the siege weapons to stop. Even if they used a fixed method, they would have to bear the attack if they wanted to break through the city gate. They would not be able to use their best strength on flat ground. The biggest possibility was that they would be destroyed during the attack. The defenders on the city gate looked down from above. Whether it was throwing combustibles or releasing rockets, it was easy. It could be said that Kant's Trondheim castle had completely become the most terrifying military fortress. Even if tens of thousands of elite troops attacked, as long as they had a small number of troops and a large number of resources, they could defend the city forever. As for the water source, the spring that connected to the water elemental plane was constantly emitting the sweetest fresh water. The excess spring water was left behind in the drainage hole that the city wall had specially opened. It was like a waterfall. It easily poured into the original lake under the west side of the city wall and the cliff. There was no problem with the pre-built water channel, including the agricultural area and the livestock area within the Oasis lookout. Perhaps the only difference was that they have changed from relying on the city wall to relying on the cliff. However, it had increased to a height of 20 meters, making this place an insurmountable natural moat. Not to mention the Naran Desert, which had a cruel and complicated environment. Even if it was a plain with a good environment and sufficient logistical supplies, they would still be helpless against this castle built on a cliff. There was simply no possibility of conquering it. Even the city gates on both sides of the southeast and the ramps that were 5 meters wide and 20 meters long would have to be piled up with human lives. However, it was more likely. Perhaps it was because countless elite infantrymen had died, and they had just smashed open the city gates and destroyed it, causing them to fall into a new kind of despair. There was still a city gate inside the city gates, but the attacks they suffered were twofold. This was because Kant had built an urn city, and on the walls of the urn city, there were arrow towers and turrets. He could deploy more archers at any time, and in an instant, arrows rained down like torrential rain. He even dug a pit in the urn city, causing the troops that attacked the city gate to suffer even more serious losses. For example, there were sharp spears and wooden thorns all over the bottom of the pit. Or, there were firewood that had been poured with grease. He could casually throw a torch, and it would turn into a fire dragon that would engulf the inner side of the urn city. He also lowered the backup iron gate at the top of the city gate, cutting off the connection between the inside and the outside. Basically, the troops that attacked from the inside were like fish on a chopping board. The troops that had to attack from the outside would also have to continue to suffer even more casualties. Kant carried out the concept of city defense in ancient and modern times and arranged for it to be built. He added a special method from the fantasy plane. Even if they were facing an army of 1,000,000 people, as long as there weren't any extraordinary powers or extraordinary creatures that were too excessive to be restrained, then the castle built on the mountain peak was equivalent to a peerless fortress that was absolutely safe. No one could directly attack and take down this castle. Kant was confident. Even if he did not care about casualties and continued to attack, he would not be able to do so. A 20-meter defense height. A well-built and well-supplied castle. Not to mention the era of fancy cold weapons, even in the modern era when gunpowder weapons were used, digging a large number of trenches or constructing underground fortresses and relying on cold weapons such as bows and crossbows would suffice to defend. Kant already had all three. He raised his head. In the sky, the Nalan sun disk also rose with the castle. At the top of the towering watchtower, a gentle sun was suspended there, as if waiting quietly. But as long as evil showed up, the blazing purification from the sun would instantly sprinkle down, purifying all evil enemies, and expelling any foreign troop class that did not belong to Kant's force. From the looks of it, Trondheim had already been raised to the limit. Come. Kant inhaled slightly, his heart very calm. He still maintained his god's perspective. He looked towards the north. At the end of the horizon, there was a faint black color spreading, seemingly in this direction. It was boundless and covered an extremely large area. The archers of Veriga who were guarding the watchtower had also noticed the abnormal situation. The news was quickly passed down. In the direction of the 4 city walls, the archers who were half resting and half on guard had received the order. They quickly got up and returned to their posts. They looked towards the north or at their respective garrisons with vigilance. They had entered a state of war. Even the bell tower had already sounded the urgent bell. The Curtain of Death. Chapter 355, Enemies of the Dead. The black fog swept over from the horizon in the north. An evil and cold aura had yet to approach, but it was already palpable in the air. Even with a temperature-regulating solar disk above their heads, they could still sense a chill. It was the wind. A breeze came from the black fog. It carried a chill, and there were even tiny snowflakes in the wind that fluttered, frozen. Although there was only a slight breeze, and with temperature control of the sun's disk, the cold was barely sensible. Even the tiny snowflakes in the wind instantly dissipated into water vapor. It was bone-chilling. That's right, a bone-chilling cold. One could sense it with their soul by mere sight. At the castle on the top of the mountain, the archers on the city wall were already on standby. The civilians still working outside were also prepared. They quickly walked up the ramp in an orderly manner and returned to the protection of the city wall. They entered the defense points of the city wall and waited for the battle orders. However, more people began to boil hot water and oil or move various military supplies. The city defense entered the martial law stage. Because the enemy had arrived. Council Hall. Inside the hall, Kant was sitting in his own seat. Van Dijk and Manide were sitting on both sides of the long table, looking at Kant with solemn faces. As the only commander in the castle, they were also waiting for orders. The enemy had arrived, and now they had to unite as a whole. This included the troop class. 50 royal knights, 30 lion knights, 18 great mages and 20 mage apprentices. These were the troop class that Kant currently had, and these were enough. If Kant wanted, he could also recruit more extraordinary troop classes with strong combat abilities. This was because his castle had the King's Sword and the Lion Knight's encampment, as well as the Mage Apprentice Quartet, which were the recruitment requirements for these extraordinary troop classes. Sitting in his seat, Kant's expression was calm. He had long anticipated the attack of the undead, but he did not expect that the undead would appear in less than 2 months, whereas he was anticipating them to take 6. The salt mine post house had already fallen, and the undead army was closing in on the Oasis lookout. This is a disgrace. Kant narrowed his eyes. His expression was calm, but there was anger in his eyes. Looking at the solemn expressions of the people in front of him, he slowly said, "In this battle, I am hoping for a spectacular win and an epic-level victory. I don't want to be left with nothing, and I also don't want any accidents that would lead to our defeat. We will do our best." Everyone said in unison. "All right." Kant nodded slowly. Although he didn't know how many undead troops there were, he could still use his morale. The right time, place, and people were all on his side. Kant didn't believe that he would lose. It was impossible for him to lose. If Kant's troops really lost the battle and were defeated or broken through by the undead army, then it meant that this place, the most important oasis lookout in the Naran desert, would be lost to the enemy, just like the post house in the salt mine in the north. At that time, not to mention the castle, even Kant himself would be unable to escape. The undead army was approaching. This already meant that it was time to fight for the supremacy of the Naran desert. If Kant lost the oasis lookout and the Trondheim castle, the consequences would be unimaginable. By that time, even the Aran city in the Senway range, which had just been built and was not as well equipped as the military facilities here, would be easily conquered. "Go down and set up your defenses." Kant waved his hand. "Yes." Everyone immediately stood up, bowed respectfully, and left swiftly. The castle's defenses had already been arranged beforehand. Manide and Van Dijk were responsible for the 2 city gates on the southeast side. They had many archers and light infantrymen under their command, including the Lion Knights who were good at close combat and melee combat at each city gate. They sent out 15 people as their high-end combat force. Kant would be the backup. In the council hall, the Royal Knights, and heavy cavalry were all stationed there. They were the reserve forces. If there was an emergency at any city defense location, as long as they sent the desert bandits and light cavalry over to convey the message, these top-notch heavy cavalry troops would quickly rush over to deal with it. Riding on war horses, they had a lot of mobility. Furthermore, they were wearing heavy armor, so their ability to fight on foot wasn't weak either. However, the probability of the city gate being broken through was extremely low. One had to know that compared to the other 20-meter steep walls, the 2 sloped city gates were the easiest places to break through. It was also the only place that could be broken through other than the airspace. As for the rock layer below the castle, that was even more impossible. In fact, the thick and heavy rock layer formed by the rules was way more than the 10-meter height exposed to the surface. Just below the desert, the entire layer of rock penetrated directly into the underground layer of rock. Not only did it penetrate deep into the sand layer, even the layer of soil and gravel at the bottom of the desert had been broken through. It was the underground bedrock that rose up. This was the workmanship of nature. It was the direct embodiment of the power of the rules. Not to mention the ordinary people. Even if the extraordinary troop class used weapons of the mystical class to excavate, it would be an extremely difficult task. No one would be that stupid. As for the undead, the top-level undead generals that had some sense in them would not attempt to break through the bedrock. Most importantly, the weapons in the hands of the undead were already rotten. Their arms were all bones, and they were naturally lacking in strength. Normal digging was already difficult, let alone directly destroying and excavating an entire layer of rock. However, Kant was not at ease with this. He muttered to himself. As his thoughts swept through his mind, cards flashed with a golden light. He had already made a decision in his heart. Vikia shooting range, ranger camp, and apprentice dormitory use increment recruitment, random. Kant gave the order. The data box in front of him immediately popped up. Ding system prompt. Victoria shooting range use increment recruitment, randomly obtain 20 people. Currently, the weekly recruitment quota is 30 people. Ranger camp uses incremental recruitment to randomly obtain 40 people. Currently, the weekly recruitment quota is 50. Apprentice dormitory uses incremental recruitment to randomly obtain 8 people. Currently, the weekly recruitment quota is 10. On the dialog box, the data column was clear. The effect of the special gift pack incremental recruitment was itself random. Kant narrowed his eyes. The number of random people this time was not bad. It basically met his psychological expectations. Although the biggest special effect was absorbed by the ranger camp and obtained a random quota of 40 people, the Victoria shooting range and the apprentice dormitory were also decent additions. Because he still had the follow-up special gift pack. Desert Bandits Camp, Victoria shooting range, apprentice dormitory use double recruitment, constant. Kant spoke. He directly chose the 3 recruitment buildings of the current Trondheim castle. Right now, this castle was the first to face the enemy. Therefore, far away in Arran City in the Senway range, it was fine to use only a few Ravenstone Rangers as long-range archers, but here, this was still the most important place to hold. Perhaps this castle would not be able to withstand it and Kant would retreat into the complex Senway range to defend. But there was still hope. Most importantly, Kant's rule over this place could not be shaken by the undead. Ding system prompt. Desert Bandits Camp double recruitment. Currently, the weekly recruitment quota is 120 people. Wikipedia shooting range uses double recruitment. Currently, the weekly recruitment quota is 60 people. Apprentice dormitory uses double recruitment. Currently, the weekly recruitment quota is 20 people. The system gave a notification. Kant said calmly, immediately recruit additional troop class. Outside the council hall, in 3 buildings, the troop class that could still be recruited this week suddenly walked out. As they were informed of the current situation, they quickly walked to where they should go. Varga archers and mage apprentices headed towards the arrow tower. As for the desert bandits, there were more of them. The place where they gathered was the main road behind the city gates on both sides of the southeast. If necessary, they would rush out of the castle. As the light cavalry with extremely high mobility, they would spread out and break into small groups. They would wantonly attack the undead troops near the castle or harass them, breaking the siege. Even if the death curtain in the outside world might affect them, it didn't matter. They still had short-range pylum. And they were part of the long-range troop class. These short-range pylum that were extremely powerful at close range, when thrown, were enough to pierce through the human body. Even the skeletons of the undead would be directly destroyed, causing the army formed by these skeletons to scatter in all directions and scatter into bones that should have dissipated. The astonishing number of desert bandits was the rapid reaction force in the castle. Their role had always been like this. They had many tactical functions. Although they weren't considered elites individually, they could still temporarily handle the situation. Of course, if they couldn't handle it, Kant, who was the reserve force, would send an extraordinary troop class to lead the knights and heavy cavalry to handle any abnormal situations. This was Kant's trump card. It was also his last trump card. Looking at the royal knights and knights who were in charge of guarding the council hall, Kant's expression was solemn. With a slight sigh, Kant stood up and walked quickly to the outside of the council hall. He planned to go to the city wall to see how the enemies coming from the north were doing. He wanted to see for himself. Lord Kant. On the northern city wall, Van Dijk was observing. Kant nodded and asked, "Yes, how is the situation?" "Not good." Van Dijk frowned. "The situation is not good." His tone was grave. "The curtain of death has formed an impenetrable smoke screen, but according to my senses, there are countless undead gathering inside the curtain. That's indeed not so good." Kant also frowned. He raised his head and looked outside. It was getting closer and closer to the north, blocking out the sky and the sun, blocking out the thick black fog in the desert. That was the most famous curtain of death of the undead. And right inside, Kant could also use the power of a king and divine power to sense the incomparably dense evil within. Moreover, their number was huge. It was as if they were truly coming from all directions, like an evil tide that erupted from the depths of the Naran desert, about to completely engulf this castle. Kant could not help but clench his fists. He said in a deep voice, "We have go all in for this battle." Chapter 356, Golden Flames. It was about to be a hard battle, and Kant's heart was unusually heavy. The evil aura of the curtain of death, which was emitting a thick darkness, had almost solidified. Even if the golden sun disk above the Oasis lookout was emitting an infinite amount of gold light, it could not completely disperse the darkness. The great power of the sun disk could only protect the critical area of this place. Death was encroaching. In the outer area that was unable to be illuminated by the golden light, the vegetation and trees that were originally lush and green instantly withered due to the bone-chilling cold. Their entire body turned grey-black as they were completely defeated by the darkness. If one were to look into the darkness, countless faint blue light spots were swaying within. An endless army of undead immediately arrived. They swept across the entire Naran desert and unscrupulously flattened it. Only when they reached the Oasis lookout and the area covered by the sun's disk did they finally stop and enter a stalemate. However, Kant and the people in the castle did not think that they had stopped the enemy's advance. This was impossible. The darkness that blotted out the sky was even denser than the golden light released by the sun disk. It was at the outermost area protected by the golden light. The black fog churned. Although the golden light was shining along with the disk, there were still wisps of black gas struggling to fuse in. But soon, the golden light on the disk would circulate, and the wisps of black gas that broke in would be instantly vaporized, turned into a void of nothingness. It was obvious that the stalemate and confrontation between the two sides would not last long. It's still not working. The sun disk can't stop the erosion of the curtain of death. Kant clenched his fists slightly. The evil aura of the curtain of death was too shocking. Although the positive energy contained in the sun disk was still strong, it was clearly not enough to completely disperse the curtain of death. He could only do his best to protect the area and mitigate the damage from the erosion. Bang 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 bang. At this moment, distant drumming was heard. The sound was intense and dull, like the waves that hit the reef on the eve of a storm. However, Kant's face instantly stiffened, including the soldiers on the city wall and arrow tower who were ready. All of them subconsciously tightened the weapons in their hands and stared at the darkness that was pressing down from the north. That's right, the curtain of death that blotted out the sun and condensed into darkness was already pressing down on them. It stretched across the entire horizon and directly surrounded the Oasis lookout, including the sky above their heads. Then, it closed up, like a demon opening its arms and pulling the Oasis lookout that was emitting a golden glow into its embrace. Countless pale blue soul flames were jumping up and down within them like tiny flames. A large amount of noise appeared around the Oasis lookout. It was the rustling sound of countless feet stepping on the sand. It was the sound of countless undead warriors. A group of warriors who should have been wiped out in history had turned back into skeletons and stood up. The undead's combat unit. Skeleton soldiers. Kant spoke slowly, his tone heavy. In the curtain of death, skeleton soldiers with white bones were wearing tattered ancient armor and holding weapons that were also rotten beyond repair. They walked out of the black fog and stepped into the golden light that was covered by the sun disk. Groups of skeleton soldiers surrounded the circular blessed land like a swarm of ants advancing together. There were so many of them. Bandake's eyes were filled with surprise. The red light in his eyes flickered. His voice was enhanced by extraordinary power and instantly appeared in the entire space. The enemy has entered our estate. Everyone, pick up your weapons and get ready for battle. Yes. On the city walls, on the arrow towers, on the towers, and even within the castle, a chorus of responses simultaneously appeared. The voice was filled with determination, and Kant's suppressed emotions were instantly broken. He turned his head to look at the many solemn faces, but his eyes were filled with vigor. With the soldiers who were fanatical towards war, he also regained his composure. The enemy had already arrived and was advancing towards them. The war had already begun. It was useless to think too much. Only. Kant took a deep breath, his eyes filled with determination. Victory will be ours. Kant unsheathed the king's sword. Looking forward, his expression was extremely serious as he ordered loudly, "Pass down the order, no free firing. Wait until the enemy has entered the 100-meter vicinity." Understood. The desert bandits immediately responded. They were Kant's current messengers, so they immediately left after receiving the order. They quickly reported this order to the various city walls, arrow towers, and city gates. Many of the Swadian crossbowmen and Variga archers also temporarily put down their bows after receiving the order. They were facing the undead. Undead skeletons devoid of flesh and blood, made up of countless bones. This meant that long-range attacks could only deal minimal damage to the undead. Even if these skeleton soldiers were hit by arrows, they would take no damage at all. Even if their bones were broken, as long as the soul fire in their heads was still lit, they would be fine. Unless their spine and skull were completely broken. Otherwise, the undead would still crawl and attack. With hatred for the living and the oppression from the higher undead commanders, they were fearless in their attacks. The undead had already lost their sanity. How would they know caution and fear? They could only fight to the death. Thus, Kant ordered the archers to stop firing freely. They were only allowed to fire when the enemy was within 100 meters of the city wall, allowing the archers on the city wall to look down from above and directly shoot through the skulls of the undead, piercing through the forehead and extinguishing the soul fire. However, before the undead could get close, the skeleton soldiers that had entered the golden light were actually moving slower and slower. That's right, their movements were indeed slowing down. It was as if they were carrying a mountain on their backs, and their footsteps became heavier and heavier. The blue soul flames in their eye sockets flickered incessantly. Even if there were intense sparks, they would not be able to escape from their eye sockets. The skeleton soldiers' movements became more and more laggard. In the end, every step they took was as stiff and halting. There was also a tiny black fog emerging from the joints of their bones. Under the golden light, the group of skeleton soldiers clearly encountered true pressure. The dense positive energy emitted from the holy pressure was something that the skeleton soldiers could not withstand at all. Moreover, just as Kant and the others narrowed their eyes, the black fog on the bodies of the skeleton soldiers became denser and denser. Then, in an instant, a ball of golden flames exploded. Huff, huff, huff. The golden flames attached themselves to the skeleton soldiers' bones, especially on their skulls. They burned fiercely, bringing with them the holy power of positive energy. The scorching temperature was like the sun burning, directly engulfing the skulls. The already faint blue soul flame was swaying. However, the golden flames spread in recklessly. Huff, huff, huff. The group of skeleton soldiers that were enveloped by the golden light felt the same. The golden flames all over their bodies continued to burn. Their forward movement finally stopped. The already weak bones finally collapsed and fell to the sand under their feet. Along with the fragments of the armor and weapons, the entire army collapsed into a pile of bones. This is the sun disk. Kant raised his head. In the sky, at the center of the golden disk, the sacred sun pattern formation was slowly glowing. Along with the pure golden light, the entire sacred sun pattern formation seemed to be circulating. Every time it rotated, the skeleton soldiers at the bottom burst out with golden flames, completely engulfing their skeleton-like body. This made Kant instantly understand that this was the power of the sun disk. Special Effect 3 Evil Expulsion. Any evil troops will not be able to approach within a 10-hectare area. If they approach, they will be automatically attacked by the holy attacks until all evil troops are defeated, leaving no one alive. The holy attack from the sun disk. It belonged to the natural holy positive energy, the opposing mode of the evil negative energy. And it was precisely because of this that the undead skeletons that had gathered evil and negative energy were mercilessly attacked by this divine artifact when they entered the area covered by the sun disk. Golden flames that contained positive energy burst out from their bodies, and even their soul fire were extinguished by the flames. It was extremely cruel. But it was extremely effective. Kant looked at the skeleton soldiers that had just entered the area covered by the sun disk and were bathed in golden light. In the blink of an eye, golden flames burst out from their bodies, and the corners of his mouth curled up into a smile. Very good. The skeleton soldiers burned in the golden flames and quickly turned into piles of bones, which were scattered on the sand. Layer by layer. A large number of skeleton soldiers disintegrated and died in the golden light. However, Kant's smile did not last long. His face became solemn again. Because the piles of skeleton soldiers had turned into skeletons. Even the bones on the ground were piled up to be more than half a meter high and more than 10 meters long. However, in the curtain of death that covered the sun's disk, there were still endless skeleton soldiers coming through. This was not a test attack, but more like a final attack with no fear of casualties. Especially on the north side. It was also the first position that appeared in the depths of the Naran desert. Groups of skeleton soldiers surged out. Their messy appearance did not have any formation to speak of. However, the relatively intact ancient armor and the seemingly good weapons on their bodies showed that these skeleton soldiers were stronger. They belonged to the true skeleton soldiers. They could not be compared to those skeleton soldiers who were like cannon fodder. Unfortunately, it still can't be done. Kant narrowed his eyes slightly. In his eyes, those stronger skeleton soldiers pushed forward. The faint blue soul fire in their eyes was even more profound. However, as the distance between them closed in, they pushed forward 100 meters toward the direction of the city wall. More and more black smoke spread out from their bodies. In the end, the entire skeleton body exploded with golden flames, following in the footsteps of the previous group of skeleton soldiers. The numbers of these evil spirits were superior, but compared to pure positive energy, they were still inferior on a fundamental level. The sun disk's power was unparalleled. Originally belonging to the era of the ancient gods, it was a strange object that showed the glory of the sun god. After undergoing a structural change through the magic system of the Unfoth Empire in the Werewind world, it completely changed from a symbol to a war machine. When it came to the concept of war, the world of werewinds, which had been in chaos for tens of thousands of years, was never inferior to any other world. Chapter 357, The Total Attack of the Undead. One after another, the skeleton warriors turned into golden flames. Piles of bones gathered and formed a shallow platform on the north side of the Oasis lookout. However, they were immediately trampled by the seemingly endless skeleton warriors that rushed over from behind. In a short moment, thousands of skeleton warriors and thousands of skeleton soldiers had already died out. However, more undead were still gathering in the black fog. They were truly fearless of life and death. They only knew to listen to the orders of the high-level undead. With hatred for the living and the desire for the real world, they opened their jaws and let out a soundless roar. Step by step, they moved their thigh bones and stepped on the shattered bones of their companions as they moved forward. This was a meaningless act of suicide. However, these skeleton warriors did not care. If they died, so be it. The undead themselves didn't really have the concept of death. In other words, low-level undead were no different from puppets without intelligence. Intelligence only existed in the brains of high-level undead, or it could be said that it was a biological instinct that disguised itself as intelligence, as well as the remaining memories from when they were still alive. Just like now, a large number of skeleton warriors appeared in the black fog, advancing in the golden light without any fear of death. This included the even larger number of skeleton soldiers that became cannon fodder. A large group of undead infantrymen were launching an attack. And right outside the Oasis lookout, which was bursting with golden flames at any moment, the group of skeletons finally advanced deeper and deeper into the middle of the Oasis lookout. The situation isn't right. Their advance is getting closer and closer. Van Dijk warned. Yes. Kant nodded. That was indeed the truth. His expression was grave. During this period of time, the undead skeleton soldiers had completely torn a hole in the northern part of the Oasis lookout. The golden light seemed to have dimmed a little. In fact, within the area covered by the sun disk, the golden spots of light that would occasionally fall like snowflakes had disappeared. Only a few spots could be seen. But soon, the golden light spots also disappeared into the air as if they had used up all their energy. Indeed, they had used up all their energy. Kant clenched his teeth slightly. Looking up at the sun disk at the top, he already came up with a theory. This strange object was able to dispel evil creatures and cause damage to these skeletons that contained evil. It was obvious that they had used their positive energy to suppress, expel, and even consume each other, forcefully extinguishing the soul fire in the eyes of those skeletons. That was the only thing that these skeletons could rely on to move and stand up to fight. The skeletons fell to the ground and turned into scattered bones. Of course, this was not without a price. The price was that the Sun Disk's Special Effect 3, Evil Expulsion, temporarily lost its effect. Looking at the frequency of the golden flames burning the undead, it was already reduced to the stage where it wouldn't even explode in half a minute. The positive energy contained in the Sun Disk that could be used to activate Special Effect 3 was almost exhausted. My lord! Just behind Kant, desert bandits rushed over. They bowed slightly and reported in a hurry. In the council hall, the mage in charge of controlling the Sun Disk asked me to report. They can't continue to let the Sun Disk kill the undead on a large scale. Okay, tell them, I understand. Kant nodded and waved his hand at the same time. Tell them to stop the evilness dispelling. Yes. The desert bandits answered. As a messenger, his task was to convey Kant's orders. Regarding the current state of the battle, Kant's orders as the Supreme Lord was absolute. Even if he couldn't dispel evilness on a large scale, he believed that he wouldn't lose against this group of undead skeletons alone. The skeletons lacked flesh, blood, and nerves. They couldn't even climb over the steep slopes. Not to mention the current cliffs and city walls. Although the evil dispersion could kill the skeletons on a large scale at a constant rate, overusing it would obviously affect the operation of the sun disk. After all, the law of conservation of energy still existed in this world. There was another reason for Kant's order. It stemmed from the origins of the undead. They themselves were the descendants of gods from the ancient times. They might even be descendants of the sun god. As long as the higher UPS still had some memory and wisdom, they would definitely understand how to deal with the solar disk that they were most familiar with. Although it had been modified by the magic system of the Unfoth Empire. In reality, the sun disk was still a symbolic wonder of the sun god. Therefore, these descendants who had once enjoyed the glory of the sun god, received the education of the gods, and turned into evil spirits for various reasons definitely knew how to deal with the influence of the sun disk. After all, in the records of the past, the golden disk that symbolized the glory of the sun god also had the special effect of dispelling evil. Or to put it another way, the special effect of evil dispersion itself was an ability that came with the sun disk. But no matter what, Kant chose to use his own force to deal with this group of spirits as a display of power. With his army, he would not care about those sun gods' descendants who had lost their glory in history and could not even maintain their former status. They had already fallen into evil and darkness and turned into spirits. Kant turned to look at Van Dijk. "Let's begin. You're in charge." "Understood." Van Dijk smiled. His eyes flashed with a faint red light. When he stretched out his hand, a faint black fume wrapped around his fingers. However, it was soon suppressed by the golden light released by the sun disk above his head and could only stick to the back of his hand. This was his extraordinary power, the power of the underworld from the world of Pandey. However, he could not use it for the time being. Taking a slow breath, Van Dijk took half a step back. At the same time, he summoned his messenger and said in a deep voice, "Give the order, archers, prepare to fire at my command." "Yes." The desert bandits quickly retreated to deliver the order. The main force was gathered on the north wall. 200 Varga marksmen, 100 Varga archers, and 10 mage apprentices were gathered here. As for the top-notch Varga marksmen, because there were only 200 people, Kant had already arranged for them to guard the arrow towers and towers at the southeast two Urn city gates, guarding against the enemy taking advantage of the chaos to attack the city gates. One had to know that the curtain PF death had already completely enveloped the entire Oasis lookout. The undead had an absolute advantage in numbers. Just by looking at the fact that Kant had ordered the sun disk to cancel and allow the evil expulsion to continue, the group of skeleton warriors in the outside world would no longer be subject to the effects of the burning of the positive energy, so there would be more and more of them. Just like the way the dark mass of ants pressed forward, one could tell that the number of those who came and went would probably number in the tens of thousands. As Kant looked at the increasing number of skeleton warriors and skeleton soldiers that were coming from all directions, the corners of his eyes could not help but twitch, and his breathing became a little heavy. Perhaps it was not calculated according to the minimum of tens of thousands. "It's getting a little dangerous." Kant gritted his teeth. His heart was beating fiercely, and he muttered in a deep voice, "From the looks of it there should be hundreds of thousands." The group of undead skeletons finally approached the north side of the city wall, including the east, west, and south walls. Similarly, in the thick black fog of the curtain of death, densely packed skeleton warriors and skeleton soldiers walked out. The undead army's siege had finally begun. Whoosh 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 whoosh. The arrows rained down like waterfall. The Varga archers quickly drew their bows and fired. They had long been ready. This included the crossbowmen who had already knocked their crossbows and aimed at the approaching skeleton warriors. As they released the string, a soft bang followed. The targets in their sights were instantly scattered into a pile of useless bones. The crossbowman's aim was already quite precise. Moreover, the crossbowmen of the kingdom of Swadia weren't too bad either. In itself, they were only second to the kingdom of Rhodux. Moreover, they had the number 1 archers on the continent by their side, and the archers from the kingdom of Victoria's assistance. Under the instantaneous explosions, the skeleton warriors that were close to the north side of the city wall fell down in large numbers. Although the scale and power were not as large as the sun disk's large-scale killing blow, the durability was stronger. The large number of crossbows and arrows that had already been prepared on the city wall were all deployed. However, the fearless skeleton warriors did not have much wisdom at all. They simply didn't care. They still held their rotten lance or long sword and moved forward. The tattered armor on their bodies could not stop the arrows that the crossbowmen shot out, and even their bodies were broken into pieces. They were trampled by the skeleton warriors behind them time and time again, and even their skulls were cracked. When they came into contact with the dense positive energy in the air outside, the soul flames flickered and disappeared into the void. The layers of skeletons had already approached the cliff. The cracking sounds of bones colliding with each other could be heard constantly. When they looked down from the city wall, they could see the thick, withered white bones mixed with the blue soul flames. It was even more terrifying. Whoosh 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 whoosh. The archers did not stop their movements at all. They were doing their best to fire all that they had. There was no need for them to aim now. There were skeletons outside the city wall. The groups of skeletons that filled the mountains and plains had already approached them. They had even entered the lake below the northern cliff. They fluttered and lost their center of gravity, scaring the fish inside. Boom, 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 boom. A violent explosion sounded. In the area by the lake, 10 fireballs suddenly exploded. On the top of the tower of the city wall, right next to the archers, the 10 mage apprentices continued to raise their magic staffs. Looking at places where the skeletons gathered the most, they chanted their incantations and threw fireballs one after another. The dark red fireballs were fueled by a large ring of flames, and exploded the moment they came into contact with the skeleton warriors. The fire dragons roared and swept the area of nearly 15 square meters. The blazing fire elements turned into flames, and the destructive effect was even stronger than the positive energy. They even destroyed the bones of the skeleton warriors, melted their skulls, and directly extinguishes soul fire inside. Mage apprentices each had 3 fireball spells and 5 magic bullet spells per day. These were all war spells. Chapter 358, An Astonishing Number of Skeletons. The fireball spell cast by the mage apprentices, which had been tempered by the Unfoth Empire for countless years, was worthy of its name. The fire elements that had condensed to the extreme directly exploded. The raging and violent fire dragons swept through all obstacles within a 15-meter radius. The scorching temperature reached thousands of degrees, and the skeleton warriors in the center were directly burned to ashes. Even more than 30 meters away from the explosion point of the fireball, the scorching air waves mixed with the flames were still rolling in the group of skeletons. The skeleton warriors and soldiers were sent flying one after another. There were also many skeleton warriors who were contaminated by the flames in the air waves and instantly turned into ash by the high temperature. Even the tattered ancient armor could not defend against it at all, and they were turned into flying dust under this high temperature. Fireballs were thrown one after another. At least 1,000 skeleton warriors were directly killed. One could tell how powerful the spells were. However, after the mage apprentices cast all 3 of their fireballs today, they had no choice but to retreat and hand over their casting positions to the Varga archers behind them. Although the spells were powerful, the spell slots limited the number of times they could cast spells. Or in other words, their endurance. As long as the crossbowmen had arrows and stamina, they could fire as many times as they wish. Mages were different. Their spell slots were fixed every day. After casting all the spells in their spell slot, they could only retreat dejectedly and hand over the heavy responsibility of long-range attacks to the crossbowmen behind them. In fact, in large-scale battles, most of the long-range damage were dealt by the crossbowmen. As for mages, they would only appear in strategic positions. For example, when enriching through the enemy's defense, or when attacking the enemy's elite troops with spells. Therefore, in normal battles, mages would never waste their precious spell slots. After all, when all the spells contained in the spell slots were ineffective, the only things left would be their weak body and their decorative wooden sticks. In close combat, they couldn't even defeat a peasant. Even the mages or great mages who had more spell slots and stronger spells would not take the risk easily. They would always leave a few spell slots to save their lives. These mages' apprentices were the same. Although they had used up the fireball spell with AoE damage, they still had the magic bullet spell. This was a single target spell. Its power was like a two-handed sledgehammer. However, due to the close range of the spell, which was only about 50 meters, the mage apprentices did not plan to release it. It would be wiser to stay behind and prepare to attack the enemies that might appear at the city wall or the city gate. Kant also understood this point, but when he looked at the skeleton warriors that were still numerous as ants, his expression became glum. The empty area where the fireball spell had exploded had been filled up once again. An astonishing number of skeleton soldiers and skeleton warriors poured out from the curtain of death. It was impossible to know how many more there were, and the higher-level skeleton cavalry and death knights had yet to appear. Even the other undead troop class had yet to appear. What Kant was facing now was perhaps only the tip of the iceberg of the undead troop. The endless natural disasters of death were using absolute numbers to crush the enemy army to death. We can only defend. Kant's expression was cold. But in his heart, he was still uncertain. He did not know how many undead army there were in the curtain of death. Could it really be endless and to the point where it'd crush the entire Oasis lookout? The skeleton warriors that had been shattered into bones were almost piled up. Even the lake was filled with skeletons. In the east, west, and south, the skeleton warriors and skeleton soldiers were mixed together. They had already arrived at the bottom of the cliff. They were using the rotten weapons in their hands to strike the rock layer in vain, leaving small white marks. In fact, their rotten weapons directly shattered, leaving the skeletons standing in place in a daze. They did not have siege weapons. They did not have climbing tools or the ability to directly reach the city walls. Therefore, the main direction of the undead's attack was automatically shifted from the north to the southeast when the large group of skeleton warriors fell. That was because there was a 5-meter wide and 20-meter long ramp on both sides of the southeast that connected the city gates. They're here. When Kant heard the sound of horse hooves, he understood. The desert bandit messengers quickly rode over. They threw away the reins in their hands, jumped off their horses, and rushed up the stairs to Kant. They reported, "My lord, the enemy is attacking the city gate." "Got it." Kant nodded calmly. At the same time, he asked the desert bandits beside him, "Which gate is Manide guarding?" "The east gate." Someone immediately answered. "Okay." Kant nodded and ordered, "Tell him to hold the east gate." "Yes." The desert bandits who answered nodded, then turned around and left. Kant thought for a while, then walked forward. At the same time, he turned to Bandake and said, "We're going to the south gate." "Understood." Bandake followed. Currently, Trondheim Castle only had 2 passageways, the south gate and the east gate. Those were the only points where the castle could be breached. Of course, they had to pay attention to them. However, there were differences between these 2 city gates. The inner part of the east gate belonged to the military administration area, and there was also a batch of reinforcements that could be deployed at any time. Manide was in charge of that area, and it could also make up for his weakness in commanding battles. Therefore, Kant asked him to simply defend with his life. Moreover, he even brought the 2 pages of the magic item that could summon elemental giants to him beforehand. The south gate was different. This city gate was used for commerce and civilians, so there were fewer troops stationed there. They needed to arrange for troops to be stationed there in advance. In an emergency, they also needed to lead troops to reinforce. Kant had asked Bandake to guard the south gate. He also planned to use his own power. After all, Bandake was now the strongest. Even Kant could not be compared to this underworld apostle. Whether it was individual combat strength or summoning a small team of underworld invaders, they could stop the invasion of the undead. Perhaps they could even create the illusion that their defense was weak and let the supernatural powers of the undead suffer a loss. They quickly moved to the south gate. On the city wall, the archers were relying on the towers and arrow towers to shoot wantonly. At the same time, there was a violent banging sound at the city gate. It was as if there were countless people outside struggling to get in. However, there was a strange crisp sound mixed with the intense banging. Kant narrowed his eyes. Of course, he could tell what the source of the crisp sound was. It was clearly the sound of bones breaking. He quickly walked up the city gate and followed the platform that had been built before to the position of the urn city gate. The 5-meter wide and 20-meter long ramp outside was already filled with the figures of skeleton warriors. They were holding a rotten lance or long sword in their hands and wearing rotten armor from the ancient times. They were crowding towards the city gate. Those skeleton warriors who had already come into contact with the city gate were using their weapons to knock on the well-made and sturdy thick wooden gate. Outside the wooden gate, there was a layer of iron bars as thick as a thumb that was welded together. It was the source of the sound. However, these skeletons could not cause any damage to the city gate at all. Perhaps they could leave some scratches. Their decaying weapons could not even knock down the thick wooden city gate, let alone the iron gate. Whoosh 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 whoosh. At the city gate, the Swadian crossbowmen and the Variga archers were still shooting arrows. Black shadows rained down like a storm. On the slope, groups of skeleton warriors fell because of this. At almost every moment, an empty slope appeared and was immediately filled up by the skeleton warriors that surged up from behind. The crossbowmen stationed at the urn of the city gate were all thoroughly elite. There were also 2 archmages who had yet to make a move. Although the 50 Variga marksmen's rapid fire was not as fast as the Ravenstone Rangers, they were still able to shoot at close range within 20 meters. Every arrow hit the forehead of the skull, so there was no issue. With the addition of the Variga marksmen's accurate shooting, the scene was very harmonious. That's right. It was very harmonious. Every time the 50 Variga marksmen and the 30 Swadian marksmen fired, they would clear the 20-meter slope of the skeleton warriors for a short while. But soon after, the space in front of them would be filled up again by the skeleton warriors. They went back and forth. The scene was unusually harmonious. Standing at the top of the urn city gate, Kant's expression was calm, and his eyes were a little more relaxed. As piles of broken bones fell down the slope, the group of skeleton warriors were accurately shot in their skulls. The danger of the city gate had not increased, and it made him feel a little more at ease. Even Van Dijk looked more relaxed. He smiled and said, "This is very simple." "Yes." Kant nodded in agreement. Simple. However, he still frowned and looked at the skeleton warriors who were still filling up the entire oasis lookout outside. The corners of his eyes were twitching. The number of these skeletons should be at least 40,000, right? Well, maybe 50,000. As you know, the skeletons don't have flesh and blood, and they occupy a small area. Van Dijk replied, "In short, there are a lot of them." Hat. Kant chuckled, but there was a hint of depression in his eyes. Then, if these skeletons focus on attacking a certain point of our position, can they form a bridge made of bones and directly charge up the city wall? This is hard to say. Van Dijk's eyes narrowed slightly, and a red light flickered. This was indeed possible. The group of Jack Allens who had passed through the Naran desert and were almost at the end of their lives were able to go all out once. With such a brazen and reckless charge of death, they had directly charged up the city wall, almost crushing Kant's original troops. Moreover, right now, those skeleton warriors did not have the concept of death. Building a wall made of bones. It was really possible. Although it was 20 meters, it was not that difficult to fill up a city wall form a slope with almost 50,000 skeleton warriors and skeleton soldiers. There might be more of the undead in the curtain of death behind them. Chapter 359, Kant's ultimate goal. The thick dark clouds were like the blackest ink. The curtain of death was covering the sky and the sun, covering the sky and the surrounding areas. The Oasis L lookout could no longer receive the light of the sun. Other than the sun disk that was still emitting a faint golden light, which brought light to this place like a real sun, this area that was completely shrouded in darkness had long been extinguished by evil in the cold. At this moment, the guards in Trondheim Castle had been fighting for a long time. They didn't even have the concept of time. The curtain of death shrouded this place, blocking out the sun. There was no sunrise or sunset, and it was unclear whether it was day or night. It was like chaos that was confusing and unclear. But it was more like the undead's hell that would never see the light of day. Outside the cliff under the city wall, broken white bones were randomly scattered on the ground. If one looked carefully, one could see many crossbows and arrows embedded in these bones. They looked like weed growing on the ground, mixed with grey and black decaying armor and weapons. It did not look like the human world. It was like hell with no possibility of reincarnation, an underworld that would sink forever, and a dark and bleak end. An unimaginable desolate place. Standing on the city wall, Kant's expression was calm, but his eyes were cold. 2 days and 2 nights had passed. If his calculations were correct, it should be 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The sky that was covered by thick dark clouds might be about to slowly darken into dusk. He was still at the top of the city gate on the south side of the Urn City. Van Dijk stood beside him. And on the ramp below the Urn City gate in front of him, there were still many skeleton warriors holding their decaying halberds, opening their jaws and letting out soundless roars. This was not a bluff. The blue soul flames in their eyes flickered. The halberds in their hands also swung forward heavily. This was a basic tactical move. These undead that still had basic biological instincts used it as skillfully as in their previous lives. The iron gate made of cast iron and the 20-centimeter thick log gate let out muffled sounds. These skeletons wanted to come in. But it was obvious. Kant and the soldiers stationed at the gate did not welcome this group of undead that only had skeletons left. No one would like a group of dead people who should have died and slumbered in the mausoleum. They would stand up, bring along rotten old things, and appear as skeletons or zombies. Yes, no one would like that. The first impression was often the most important, and many people would maintain this for a long time. And the undead had precisely the worst first impression. No one would feel good if they saw a dead body rise again. Moreover, these undead were truly terrifying on the outside. They hated the living. They did not possess any means of communication. They even spread disease and pestilence, and a bone-chilling cold. Just look at the dark and evil curtain of death outside the Oasis lookout. Even the sun disk could barely hold on. If it wasn't for the help of such a strange object that contained extremely positive energy, the Oasis lookout would have long been enveloped by the evil and darkness. It would have been devoured by the terrifying undead under the cold, disease, and other negative buffs. Perhaps in the end, even its own body would become a part of the undead, becoming a member of the undead army. Just thinking about it makes me feel embarrassed. Kant spoke softly, a hint of gloominess flashed in his eyes. He looked at the large number of skeleton warriors and skeleton soldiers below, and there was an extreme depression between his brows. Now that we are surrounded by these terrifying undead, we are already in an embarrassing situation. Of course. Van Dijk nodded. It looks like that on the surface. Kant frowned. Do you have a good idea? I don't. Van Dijk shrugged. My lord, on the other hand, if the undead want to attack the city, they don't have a good plan either. Even if they can attack the city wall, what can they do? Yes. Kant pondered for a bit and did not answer. He understood what Van Dijk meant. These undead were not enough to threaten the city wall. Even if they were attack a certain point like they expected, using the skeletons of the skeleton warriors and soldiers to build a ramp that allows the following troops to charge up the city wall, it would not be a big deal. Because Kant still had infantry troops stationed on the city wall. For example, there were 1,000 Swadian footmen and 3,000 civilians who could be recruited as armed militia at any time. As for the main force of the undead, which was the skeleton warriors, not to mention the Swadian footman who was wearing a full set of mail armor, holding a sword, shield, and lance, even if they were wearing leather armor, the militia who were holding spears and warhammers could form a neat formation and easily kill them in a frontal attack. Even the strong civilians who were holding long scythe, wearing normal linen robes, and wearing leather hat could easily kill 4 to 6 skeleton warriors if they tried their best. The ability to fight alone was not an advantage of the undead. Of course, even if it was a group battle, the undead would not be able to do it. It was not their advantage. It was a constant battle of attrition. It was the advantage of the undead for doing everything they could to drag the enemy into this endless battle of attrition. It consumed resources, stamina, morale, faith, time, soldiers, and everything else that could be used to exhaust the enemy to death. This was the advantage of the undead. After the opponent was exhausted to death, new soldiers would reappear due to the characteristics of the undead. It was still an endless undead army. The endless consumption continued. Just like now, Kant, who was surrounded by the undead, had been dragged into a battle of attrition by the undead. The battle that lasted for 2 days and 2 nights did not stop. The tireless undead continued to attack crazily. They knocked on the iron gate and thick wooden city gates ceaselessly, making clanging sounds. By this time, everyone was already familiar with this sound, and even numb to it. This was the battle of the undead's attrition. It had already consumed a large number of arrows, exhausted their stamina, and at the same time, also consumed their morale and faith. Kant turned his head. On the city wall, the elite Variga marksman was already resting. He was sitting at the back with his eyes closed to rest. Even the level 3 Swadian crossbowmen were already lying lazily on the city wall. They were bored to death as they watched the skeletons below the city wall knock on the city gate in vain. They would only occasionally shoot an arrow to kill the fiercest ones for fun. It had only been 2 days and 2 nights, and everyone had already lost a large amount of faith. After all, they were all living people. Even the desert bandits who were waiting below were only walking back and forth with their desert horses. They were not like before, riding their warhorse in an awe-inspiring manner and galloping around quickly to inspect any abnormalities. Trondheim Castle was currently extremely safe. Even if it was in an encirclement status, it was still extremely safe. But this safety was not easy. It was not an almost numb relaxation. Kant narrowed his eyes slightly and said in a deep voice, "Ban fake." "Here." Ban Dake instantly replied. "This cannot go on," Kant said. Looking around at the endless skeleton warriors that occupied most of the Oasis lookout, Kant said, "I am prepared to launch a counterattack and wipe out the skeletons that have appeared in front of me." "You mean taking the initiative to attack?" Ban Dake frowned slightly. "That's right." Kant nodded. "This is a little dangerous." Ban Dake said in a deep voice, "My lord, this requires careful consideration." "I understand," Kant said. "It is precisely because I have considered it that I have decided on this plan. Wiping out these undead is one of my goals. More importantly, it get everyone back on high alert." "I understand." Ban Dake nodded. Kant waved his hand. "Go and make the arrangements. I need all the light infantrymen to fight." "Yes." Ban Dake bowed and turned to leave the city wall. Soon, along with the sound of a large number of footsteps, the 1,000 Swadian footmen soldiers had already formed up inside the city gate. Each of them held a sword and shield in their hands and were ready for battle. The eyes under the helmets of the infantrymen had regained their luster. The upcoming close combat made all the archers on the city wall slightly stunned. Even the mage apprentices who were resting in the tower walked out. This was their first time taking the initiative to attack. Let's begin. Kant waved his hand and gave his orders. As the door shaft let out a slightly sour sound of friction, and as the rotating wheel slowly raised the iron gate, the south side of the city gate immediately opened, allowing these light footmen to enter the Urn City. The Urn City was safe, and it could accommodate 1,000 people just as well. It was the barrier of the inner city gate. The archers on the four walls were ready. When the Urn City gate opened, the flood of skeleton warriors would rush in. And that was the most dangerous moment. If they could not hold on, the Urn City gate would fall, causing the entire Urn City to fall. Although Kant's troops could take back the Urn City, it was still equivalent to defeat. Lord Kant, isn't this a bit risky? Behind him, Man-eyed, who had rushed over from the east gate, bowed and greeted him. At the same time, he tried to dissuade him, we haven't reached the limit of our defense. Those skeletons can't do anything to us either. It's not wise to attack rashly. No, it's very wise. Kant replied indifferently, this is also an experience. Experience? Man-eyed was slightly stunned. Experience. Although it was said to be simple, it was actually a fierce battle. Of course, he understood Kant's meaning. It was to let these 1,000 Swadian footmen go through a real battle and gain experience. From there, they would miraculously obtain a promotion. A qualitative change in promotion. A promotion from a level 3 troop class to a level 4 troop class. This was Kant's ultimate goal. Wiping out the skeletons and rebuilding morale were secondary. Upgrading to a high-level troop class was his goal. Whether it was the level 4 Swadian infantry or the level 4 Swadian heavy cavalry, they were all powerful elite troops. As long as there were 500 of them, Kant could guarantee that they would be able to kill tens of thousands of skeleton warriors or skeleton soldiers in a head-on battle. The armored infantry and heavy cavalry were not something that the rotten weapons in the hands of the skeletons could deal damage to. They probably could not even break through their defenses. Based on the current situation, those skeleton warriors and skeleton soldiers did not have the strength to do so. Perhaps the defense of these Swadian footmen could not be broken through. Chapter 360, The Powerful Infantrymen. However, before the gates of the Urn City could be opened, the skeleton warriors on the ramps still needed to be cleaned up. With a slight frown, Kant turned his head and glanced at the towers on both sides. He ordered, Mage apprentices, use all your strength to cast fireballs. Clean up the area under the ramps so that it is convenient for the troops to enter and exit. Yes. A messenger immediately received the order and left. Soon, 4 mage apprentices appeared on the tower. They raised their staffs and pointed downwards. As the slightly scorching fireballs burned down, the entire ramp instantly exploded into balls of fire dragons. They whistled and released an infinite amount of heat waves, swallowing the hundreds of skeleton warriors and skeleton soldiers. The flames burned most of the skeletons, and the scorching fire elements directly corroded the soul fire in the skulls. In the end, everything calmed down. The entire slope was only left with a grayish-black smoke. The countless skeleton warriors behind them did not care at all. They still held their rotten weapons and rushed forward. Obviously, this was not the first time they had seen such a scene. It was not the first time the fireball spell cleared the slope. However, this fireball spell did not end after it exploded. The mage apprentices on the tower continued to cast their spells. Another fireball spell rushed down, but it exploded at the bottom of the slope. The surging fire dragons not only destroyed any skeletons that dared to approach, they also pushed the skeleton warriors that continued to rush over from behind, causing them to fall to the ground. Whoosh 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 whoosh. Varga marksmen had already launched their accurate rapid fire. Cone arrows poured down like a torrential rain on the 5-meter wide and 20-meter long slope, directly blasting away the surviving skeleton warriors' heads, completely clearing up the slope. For a top-notch marksman, this was simply a piece of cake. Now! Kant's eyes flashed. He waved his hand forward and ordered in a deep voice, Open the city gate! Open the city gate! Following that, the soldiers in charge of the city gate began to move. The winch of the iron gate pulled the thick hemp rope and pulled the heavy cast iron gate up. All 3 bolts on the heavy wooden gate at the bottom were lifted, completely opening the 3-meter-wide city gate. Van Dijk wore chain armor and stood at the front of the orderly formation of Swadian footmen. He was the general who led the troops to attack this time. Attack! Van Dijk was the first to take a step forward. Behind him, the 1,000 Swadian footmen formed a 5-team formation. They immediately followed up and slowly pushed forward. Both of their hands gripped the standard lance tightly, forming a dense phalanx of long spears. Especially the light footman at the front. He placed his spear horizontally, and with a step, he pushed forward with his spear. The tip of the spear was still shining with a cold light under the golden light above their heads. Facing the skeleton warriors who were temporarily blocked by the crossbowmen and were unable to successfully step onto the ramp, the light footmen crossed the city gate and finally arrived. They walked faster and faster. Stop shooting! Kant stretched out his hand and clenched his fist. The desert bandits at the side all shouted at the same time and quickly passed down the order. The light infantry soldiers had already entered the ramp and were about to reach the bottom. If they continued shooting, they might accidentally injure their own side. This was because the group of skeleton soldiers sensed that there was finally a human army attacking, and they were all boiling with excitement. A silent roar sounded out, and the crisp sound of bones colliding with each other reverberated through space. The soul fire flickered in their eyes. The rotten halberd and long sword were already tightly gripped by the bones in their hands, and they quickly moved forward, slashing towards the human infantrymen who were also charging towards them. The 2 sides collided heavily. Caw 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 caw. The sound of bones breaking could be heard continuously. The skeleton warriors on the top floor had not even managed to slash their long halberd. The Swadian footmen that were lined up in front of them had already gripped their long spears tightly with both hands, thrusting them down heavily. The long halberd that intersected with each other instantly broke apart. Even the once magnificent and sturdy ancient armor was directly shattered. The body that was made up of bones was also pierced through. To the skeleton warriors that were not made of flesh and blood, although this was not considered a fatal injury, but the Swadian footmen's spears instantly shattered their sturdy structures into pieces, and they turned into a pile of useless bones. There were even some who had their skulls pierced through by the spear. The soul fire within was completely shattered, allowing the undead to re-enter a state of eternal slumber. Kill! Van Dijk's attack was even simpler. He only waved the knight's sword in his hand, and the blade that was imbued with the power of the underworld easily sliced through the fragile bones, eventually corroding the soul fire within the skull, allowing the undead to return to decaying. This was not the time to go all out. Teams of Swadian footmen rushed down, surrounding the slope to establish a defensive line. The sturdy fan shield was already placed on his left hand. It was now a chaotic battle. The effect of a spear was actually not as good as a spade sword that could be swung. And this spade sword had a shorter attack range, which was equivalent to a short sword. However, in this chaotic battle environment, it could be swung at a faster frequency, allowing the sharp blade to cut through the rotten weapons and armor, tearing apart the outer shell of the skeleton warriors. Immediately arrange for 5 mage apprentices to enter the battlefield and cast status-type spells. On the city wall, Kant gave the order. Soon, the 5 mage apprentices who were transferred from the other city walls quickly arrived at the battlefield along with the opening of the Urn City Gate. Sharp Metal Spell. This was the spell they cast. The front row of the Swadian footmen received this spell. As the golden light gathered on the blade of the Teutonic sword in their hands, their slashing became easier, and the destructive power they caused was even more terrifying. Even the skulls of the skeleton warriors could be cut in one strike, just like the sharpest longsword. For Lord Kant. For Swadian. The light footmen who witnessed the power of the spell cried out. They lined up neatly in a semicircle. The formation was 4 layers thick. They faced the attack of the group of skeleton warriors together. However, at their feet, bones had already piled up. A large number of skeleton warriors and skeleton soldiers were basically cannon fodder, posing no threat to these light infantrymen. Even if they could use their weapons to hack at these infantrymen, it would not do. A rotten longsword or halberd would not be able to cut through the mail armor that had passed through the kingdom of Swadia and was strictly supervised. Usually, even if these rotten weapons broke themselves, they would only leave a small mark on the mail armor, and tear apart the linen robe that they were wearing. However, every time the light infantrymen swung their Germanic swords, the undead skeletons, be it the stronger skeleton warriors or the weaker skeleton soldiers, would be chopped into a pile of broken bones. Not to mention the heater shield. Raising their shields to withstand the more fatal attacks, they were even pushing forward. They moved forward step by step, bypassing the bones that were as deep as their calves. They hacked at the skeletons, turning them into broken pieces. Then, they went from 4 layers to 3 layers, or even 2 layers. They actually managed to kill their way out. And they even withstood the attacks of the numerous skeletons. Very good. Kant saw it clearly from the top of the city wall. Below, the ramps outside the Urn City gate had already been cleared out into a large area. Those light infantrymen were like embankments, protecting the fertile fields in the lowlands. They forcefully blocked the waves formed by the skeletons outside, ensuring their safety. However, the distance that these light infantrymen had extended to had already reached its limit. Forming 2 layers side by side was their limit. The danger of having only 1 layer of the defensive was too great. If the skeletons broke through at a certain point, it would mean that the entire defensive line had been broken through. Everyone would be met with misfortune. At that time, if they were to retreat in an emergency, it might even turn into a runaway scene. Even now, they had already sensed the limits of their advancement and began to retreat slowly. Van Dijk also ordered them to retreat. Some of the light infantrymen in the front row were slightly injured, and there were quite a number of them. After all, there were a lot of skeletons, and they came one after another. No matter what, they could still cause some pain to the exposed skin of the light infantrymen, or even slightly pierce through the mail armor, causing superficial injuries. In the end, the light infantrymen retreated and once again faced the enemy in a 4-layered formation. Those who were injured rested and healed at the back. After some simple bandaging and ensuring that their stamina had recovered, they continued to push forward to the front line and fought with all their might. As for the light infantrymen who had already exhausted their stamina, they would come to the back to rest at this time. If anyone was injured, they would also carry out simple bandaging to ensure that no one would be injured to the point where their life would be threatened. Moreover, there were mage apprentices. Every time they cast a sharp golden blade, it could last for 20 minutes. Each person would do it twice a day. This also happened to be the time for the front and back rows to rotate. As long as the front row could not hold on any longer, the back row would use the Germanic sword that was reinforced with a sharp golden blade to push forward. They would quickly clean up the weak skeletons and let their companions retreat to the back to rest. They fought for an hour in front of the ramp, and the number of skeletons piled up was too many. They even raised the ground. The light infantry's defensive line was still not broken through. It's about time. Kant narrowed his eyes slightly, looking at the formation below that was already beginning to shake. He ordered in a deep voice, "Open the city gates, let the heavy cavalry go down and fight on foot. Cover the light infantry and retreat." "Yes." The desert bandits answered and immediately left to convey the order. Very quickly, 300 heavy cavalry soldiers lined up with shields. Holding longsword in hand, they quickly walked down the slope and stood in front of the light infantry. They even cut down the skeletons that were swarming over, turning the undead into bones again. However, this time, they were not advancing, but retreating. The light infantry supported each other and quickly returned. Under the cover of the heavy cavalry, they easily returned to the inner side of the Urn City. The heavy cavalry also retreated step by step, stabilizing their formation. They retreated back on the ramps and finally returned to the city gates, to the protection of the city. Close the city gates, Kant ordered. The cast iron gate that was originally bound by the winch and hung at the top of the city gates was instantly lowered. The heavy iron gate smashed against the city gates, shattering the skeleton warriors that were still rushing over and blocking them out. However, there were still over 20 skeleton warriors that rushed over. But the heavy cavalry at the back easily chopped off their skulls with a swing of their sword, scattering them into piles of broken bones that were stacked in front of the city gate.